Welcome to our special series of Let's Talk for KubeCon EU, and I'm your host Swapnil Bhartia. My next guest is Richard Lee, CEO and founder of Ambassador Labs. Richard, it's great to have you on the show.
Swapnil, it's a pleasure to be here.
Before we get started, I would love to know a bit more about Ambassador Labs. Tell me about the company and also what's the story behind the name Ambassador Labs.
So, Ambassador Labs, we are a venture funded startup focused entirely on developer experience for Kubernetes. So, we are focusing on application developers who are using Kubernetes and how to make their lives easier. We got our name actually because we were actually previously a company called DataWire, and we had a number of open source projects in the Kubernetes ecosystem. Our most popular one was actually Ambassador API Gateway, and a lot of people just associated that with us. And so we ended up choosing to rebrand ourselves as Ambassador Labs.
Can you also talk about what kind of open source projects that you're involved with? You already mentioned that.
Yeah, so we have two core open source projects that we contribute and maintain. Both of them are part of the CNCF. One of them is called Telepresence, which is a tool for developing locally against remote Kubernetes clusters. And the other one is the Ambassador API Gateway, which we have recently just renamed to the Emissary Ingress, which is also part of the CNCF. So that's an API gateway built on Envoy proxy that runs just in Kubernetes.
Since you mentioned Emissary Ingress, it was recently promoted from sandbox to incubation status at CNCF. What I do see is most of these projects, they're already in production. So what does this status change mean? First, for users, and second, for the project itself?
So Emissary Ingress was actually not actually part of the CNCF. We actually decided to just submit it directly into incubation due to its broad production usage. And for our user base, the reason why we contributed it was to really grow that community. So we've been the founder and primary developer of the Emissary Ingress project, but there's been over 150 other developers who've actually contributed. And we felt that the right home for this project, because we really want to grow that project, was in a vendor neutral space. And in the Kubernetes ecosystem, the CNCF is the natural place for that.
There is sandboxing, there's incubation, there is graduation. What do these status mean for real community? Because as you earlier mentioned, most of these projects are already in production. So talk about that aspect. That what do all these labels, tags, sandbox versus incubation versus graduation mean in the real world?
Sure. So Sandbox really is more of an experiment. And so the real metric between Sandbox, incubation, graduation is really around community adoption and traction, right? So it's less around production usage. Sometimes that's correlated, obviously, with your community. But with Sandbox, you're really trying to launch a project. With incubation, you already have a mature community. You have lots of contributors, lots of users. And then with production or graduation, you're really a very mature, robust governance, lots of different contributors, and a fully established governance structure, which is what we're working towards with Emissary Ingress.
Right. Can you also talk about what kind of roadmap is there for the project? Of course, this is open source project, so anybody can go and check it out. But from your perspective, what plans do you have for the project?
So we have several priorities for the project. Number one is continue to support the latest evolution of Kubernetes standards. And so most recently, that's with the Gateway API. The second thing is to continue to make it easier to use for developers. And so figuring out different ways to actually make the observability, rate limiting, authentication functionality of Emissary Ingress even more accessible than it actually is. And third is to just make it easier for people to contribute to, in terms of making it easy to run tests and check out the code and contribute and documentation and all those different things.
When we do look at Kubernetes cloud native space, it is going through of course, massive adoption is there, is skyrocketing, and a lot of new use cases are also there. Plus, because of this pandemic, companies, they have accelerated their move to the cloud or the digital transformation. What does this mean for the project itself, or in general, the company?
So we're certainly seeing an acceleration of initiatives to move workloads to Kubernetes, right? There's no question about that. That was happening pre-pandemic, and pandemic has accelerated that. What we're seeing subsequent to that is that even though there's an intention of moving more workloads to the cloud, The blocker for that workload migration is increasingly application development because it's easy to get one or two workloads running in the cloud. But then as you want to migrate the other 99% of your workloads to the cloud, it really depends on development. And that's where we come in. We're really focused on accelerating that developer experience on Kubernetes so you can accelerate that workload migration.
Initially, you alluded to the company. You also gave a quick, kind of summary and overview of the company's doing. Can you give our viewers, complete picture of what kind of services or products the company is offering, leveraging some of these open source projects?
So we offer a set of open core products built on the open source projects that we provide that provide enterprise functionality, including authentication, enterprise support, those kinds of things that typically enterprises need. And all of this is actually now being packaged as part of our developer control plane solution.
You are looking at a specific problem in the Kubernetes space and trying to solve that. If you look at cloud native space, Kubernetes in general, as I was earlier saying, the adoption is growing. What are some of the pain points that you see, not only the ecosystem is facing, but the customers are also facing that when you look at them, you say, hey, you know what? The Kubernetes CNCF community still have to solve those problems. Have you come across any such?
Absolutely, Swapnil. The number one problem we see is everyone goes to visit the CNCF landscape and they're overwhelmed with how comprehensive it is. There's so many different vendors on this, right? That tool sprawl, that vendor sprawl is the number one challenge that we see people adopting the Kubernetes ecosystem because they're saying, I can't understand all these different challenges. And that's a big problem that I think as a community that we need to solve.
It's a joke there. CNCF is like Unix philosophy. There is a file for everything, and every file does only one thing. If you do look at this comprehensive landscape, do you see any, of course it is happening, but do you see any consolidation, any merger that is not only happening, but we should speed it up? You're right, because, yes, as good as it is to see such, a massive community, but it is intimidating, and that also leads to, very, very complex, environment. A lot of companies get intimidated with that. Plus, there is a shortage of talent already. So when you add shortage of talent with things moving in production, and then a lot of mistakes happen, and then we lead, it's the overall experience. Security becomes a big issue, and there are a lot of other challenges. So if I ask you the high level overview, what do you think should happen to not shrink the community, but to consolidate and streamline all these projects?
I think, the reality is I think consolidation will inevitably happen over time. In the interim, and that takes a little while. In the interim, I think what we can do as a community is to adopt clear interfaces and standards and work to make sure that all of our software really interoperates with other people's software, because we just have to understand that software itself doesn't operate in an abstraction. And so what we do, right, with the developer control plane is to really try to integrate with a wide spectrum of software so that recognizing that not everyone uses the same CI system and not everyone uses the same observability system, but they need them all to work together.
Richard, thank you so much for taking time out today and not only talk about the company, the project, but also the pain points of the wider CNCF Cloud Native community. And I look forward to talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Swapnil, thank you for having me.